recording, we're going to take a look at shape layers in After Effects and show how you can create graphics using shape layers without having to go outside of the program to Illustrator or Photoshop. Using shape layers is a good way to be able to design stuff and create stuff right inside of After Effects. All right, so here's an example. I've got simple target scope animation using a few shape layers. So let's introduce how to get started with these. All right, I'm going to make a new project. And I'm not going to import any assets. I'm just going to design something right here inside of After Effects. So I'll create a new composition. I'm going to call it Target Scope. And I'm going to choose my frame size and frame rate and my duration. That's fine. I hit OK. Now, the first thing to understand about shape layers is they are object-based layers. When you create a shape layer, okay, up here in the toolbar, this is your group of shape tools right here, rectangle, rounded rectangle, and so forth. When you grab one of these, if you do not have a layer already selected and you make a shape, it's going to create a shape layer, okay? So that's one way of making shape layers. Another way of making shape layers is with the pen tool. And again, if you do not have a layer already selected and you draw with the pen tool, it's going to create a shape layer. Okay, so keep that in mind. You know, if you have a layer selected already and you use one of those tools, it makes a layer mask. So actually, I think we've seen that in a previous lesson, but just for demonstration here, if I have a text layer, for example, and I have that layer selected, and I make a mask either with the shape tool or the pen tool, you can see what happens. Instead of making a shape layer, it makes a layer mask on that existing layer, right? So that's something to be aware of. Same is true here with the pen tool, right? If I draw a pen path and make it a closed shape, it becomes a mask on that layer. Okay, so that's one way of using those tools. But the way we're talking about here today is if we do not have a layer selected and we make a shape or we draw a shape, it becomes a shape layer filled in with color. And you will see your fill and stroke color options for your shape layer up here in the option bar at the top of the screen. If you click on the word fill, you can choose either no fill, solid color, gradient, or linear radial gradient. Okay, so different color options. Oops, not really seeing any gradient color there, but anyway, let me start again here with this layer. I'm going to delete this shape layer. Let's start with a new one. Draw a simple rectangle. Again, if we click the word fill here, we get these different options. So there we go. Now you can see the gradient options, solid color, gradient, and so on. And so when you choose one of these fill options, you can then click on the swatch right here. And of course, you can customize your color options. But you can also customize your gradient by adding additional color values, changing opacity levels, and you can get very creative with how you use your gradients there. Now, when you do use a gradient fill for your, oops, let me change the opacity here. That one's 100, that one's 100. Not sure why I'm still getting no, oh, I have an extra tab there. There we go, delete it. To delete a tab, by the way, you just click on it and drag it away from the gradient editor. Okay. Now within the shape here, if you want to adjust the angle and length of the gradient, you can switch to the arrow tool. You'll see a couple little blue dots that you can click and drag to, you know, customize your gradient. So again, your fill, color options, gradient options and stuff up here. Also stroke options, if you activate the stroke color and pick a color, and then you can pick a stroke width, Okay, so shape, when you create a shape layer, you're going to have these fill and stroke options up here at the top. Now, the first thing that we really need to understand about shape layers, like I said, they're object-based layers. You can have multiple shapes on a single layer. See, if I take the rectangle tool and I do another one, it gives me another shape on that same layer. See, now I have two rectangle groups within the layer. And so the first thing I want to explain here is that the layer transform properties affect the entire layer and everything that's on it. So if I open up the layer transform group and I rotate, you can see it rotates the entire layer as opposed to rotating the individual rectangles. Each shape group, if you open it up, has its own transform properties as well. In fact, look, you can see it has multiple groups of properties, including stroke and gradient fill or solid color fill, depending on what color options you've chosen up here. Okay, so you do have those same options here within the layer, but there's also a transform group, and the thing I wanted to point out here is if you say rotate within that shape groups transform group, see, it rotates the shape on the layer. This is different than rotating the layers, rotation, right? See, big difference there. Okay, so just be aware of that the transform group for the layer affects the entire layer and everything that's on it, whereas the transform groups that you see within each of the shape groups will only affect that individual shape. So you can scale, rotate and move the individual shapes. So again, object-based layers. Shape layers are inherently vector layers. Notice that the rasterize switch is automatically on. You can't turn that switch off. And this is a good thing because it means you can scale up your shape layers to any size and the edges remain nice and sharp. Okay, so that was a quick introduction. Now let me go ahead and delete that layer again, and I'm going to create a little graphic here. I'm going to take my rectangle, I'm going to draw a rectangle, I'm going to turn off my fill value, and I've got my stroke option turned on here. Down here in the layer, I want to make sure that the rectangle I just drew is centered on my layer. So first tip I want to show here is if you go into the shape group and into the transform group, the position value you see there is the position of the shape on the layer. And the origin is 0, 0. That means if you zero out the position numbers, your shape will be perfectly centered on your layer. So you can see that here. The shape is totally centered on the layer here. Now, another thing to understand about shape layers is when you draw shape layers with the rectangle and the ellipse and these tools, these are what's called parametric shapes because the shape is defined by parameters, and that's what the first group, the path group, is. Those are the parameters that define the shape. So here's where you'll see the size of the rectangle, for example. Or if I wanted to add corner roundness, there's a roundness attribute. Okay, and there's another position value here as well, kind of redundant with the one in the transform group. But point being that when we draw shapes with the shape tool, they are parametric shapes, shapes defined by parameter. This is as opposed to when we draw shape with the pen tool. If I draw shape with the pen tool, this is what's called a Bezier shape, see, because this shape is defined by control points and Bezier curves, right? So it's not defined by numeric parameters like the rectangle was. It's defined by points and curves or splines, okay? So that's Bezier shape. And notice that with the Bezier shape, under the layer here, it has a path group, but there's only one property there called path to animate that path shape. So again, it's not defined by numerous parameters, it's just defined by one singular path property. Now, one point I will make here, If we start with a parametric shape like a rectangle that has, numeric parameters, and you decide that you want to be able to edit it as a Bezier path, you can right-click on the shape group, or excuse me, on the path group here, there we go, and you'll see an option, Convert to Bezier Path. And when you choose that, see the numeric parameters went away, and now there's just a path property, and I could now edit that shape as a Bezier path with Bezier curves. Okay, so it is possible to start with a parametric shape and convert it to a Bezier shape. You can't go the other way though. Bezier shapes cannot be converted into parametric shapes. That only goes one way. All right, I'm going to undo, hitting Command Z here, go back to this being a parametric shape. And I'm just going to finish designing a quick little target scope here to introduce a few more things. So I'm going to go to my stroke group here, and one of the things I wanted to point out is in the stroke group, there is a dashes subgroup, kind of good to know about. If you hit the plus button, it'll add dash values, and you can control the number of dashes on the path. And kind of a neat thing you can do with dashed lines is if you animate this offset value, you can make the lines move, make it look like it's moving. So in this case here, I'm going to set a keyframe for offset. I'm going to go a few seconds forward, and I'm going to go ahead and just put in an arbitrary number here, maybe like 200. I'm going to hit N to set the end of my work area, do a quick preview, and that looks pretty cool. Okay, so that's an easy way to create, an animated line there. If I want it to be moving faster, maybe I'll use a bigger number, 400 instead of 200. All right, looks pretty cool. Now, another thing we can do with shape groups is we can duplicate them. If I wanted to make, say, another rectangle, a little bit smaller than this one, instead of drawing a new one, I could just take this group and do Edit Duplicate. See, a second rectangle group is created with the same settings. I'll open it up, go to its parameters, and I'll make the size value for the width and the height a little smaller. I might adjust the roundness value a little bit. I might go to my stroke value here and adjust the stroke width, make this one a little thinner. Pretty cool. All right, so you see how easy it is to start to develop your graphic when you duplicate your groups. So we can have multiple shapes on a single layer. Now that doesn't mean you have to do everything on the same layer though. If you do want to start a new shape layer, just deselect that one, and then you can go ahead and draw your next shape. So I'm going to use the rectangle tool here. I'm going to make a kind of rectangle box for in the center here. I'm going to turn off the stroke option, and I'm going to turn on the fill option with solid color, and I'm just going to fill it with white. So basically just making kind of a line. I want it centered on my layer, so I go to my shape group, go to the transform group, and zero out those position numbers. So now it's centered. If I want to control the width and height exactly, precisely, I can go in here and, type in the exact numeric values, because again, it's a parametric shape. And then I'm going to duplicate that, Command D, and go in here, and I could either rotate it or I could change the size parameters so that it looks like it's perpendicular to the other. Okay, so easy to, just duplicate and modify settings. I'm going to call this layer crosshair. That's the crosshairs in the center, and this one, of course, is the outer rectangles. So I'll call this one outer rectangles. Okay, so again, you can use as many shape layers as you want. Now remember, your layer transform group affects the entire layer, all the shapes that are on it. So like in this case, if I want the crosshairs to be smaller, I can go to my layer transform group and just scale down the entire thing. Whoops, not that small. There we go. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. See what else I want to do with this. I think I'll make some cross hatches here on the sides. So I'll start a new shape layer by deselecting the previous ones. Again, I'll use my rectangle to do this. Draw a line, something like that. Go to my group here and go into the path options to manually define the size. I'm going to go 10 for the width, and I'm going to go 200 for the height. I'm going to go to the transform group. Now I know that if I zero out the position, it'll be centered on the layer, right? If I go 0, 0 for the position. But in this case, I don't want it centered. I want it to be down here. So I'll scrub this Y position value and put it down here where I want it. I'll round that number just to make things easy here, 350. And that way, to make one up at the top, I can just take this one and hit Command D, go to that transform group, and instead of a positive 350, I'll do negative 350. So now that shape is up at the top here, see? Now I want to do the same thing for the sides. So I could duplicate and modify, or if I want, I could just take the shape tool again and draw another line over there, and then go into the settings. So this one I'll do 200 wide and 10 high. And then I will adjust the position. Again, I know that if I start from 0, 0, it's going to be centered. And then I can scrub the value and get it placed where I want. In this case, I'm going to go, looks like about 600. And I'll duplicate it. So now I've got 4 rectangles on this layer. This one will go to negative 600. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's the basic idea. You can see how easy it is to start, building a graphic using shape layers, and by duplicating, by modifying settings, using the stroke and fill values. You can get very creative. Now, just a couple last things I want to show in this recording, though, because one of the cool things about shape layers is that there are unique properties that you can add to the layers to create added effects. So for example here, let's say I wanted to create like a little meter or something here in the corner or down here in this corner. I'll take a rectangle and I'll go ahead and make a little line down here, make a new shape layer with a little line. I'm going to change the color of that. I'll make it red. And see here next to the contents, there's an add pop-up menu. And if you click on that, these are all the things that you can add to your shape group. So these are, unique properties that you can add to the group. So I'll start with the one called repeater. This is a good one to know about. Instead of, if you want to do something, to create multiple copies of something, instead of having to duplicate it over and over and over again, you can add what's called a repeater. So if I add a repeater to the group, you can see it adds a new group after the rectangle called repeater. If I open it up, you'll see there's a copies parameter and an offset. There's also a transform group for the repeater. And first thing to point out here is the position in the transform group for the repeater controls the position of the repeating copies. In this case, I think I want them to go vertically, so I'll zero out that X value and I'll make the Y value maybe 25. Or you know what, let's go the other way. Let's go minus 50. There we go. Again, you can always scrub these numbers. So you know what, maybe like minus 70 in this case. Okay, now if I go to the number of copies here, you can see, oh, look, I can control how many repeating copies there are. Pretty cool. And another neat thing within the repeater, there's a start opacity and an end opacity value. So if you want, to make the opacity kind of drop off, you can. So it might be cool in this case if I'm creating a little, screen element, little graphic here to animate the number of copies. Maybe I make the number of copies just kind of randomly, fluctuate up and down. So it's like a little meter that's animating. And I'll just copy and paste the first keyframe to make it the same as the last one. So it just creates a little animated element there on the side. Pretty cool. Let's do one more example. Let me give these things names. Good idea to name these layers descriptively. I'll call this one cross hatches. I'll call this one red meter. And I'll do another little graphic up here in the corner. Again, just using a rectangle. I'll draw a rectangle here. Let me pick a different color. Okay, that. Let me zoom in a little bit so we can see it better. And if I go to the contents group, click on add, again, there's all this fun stuff to explore here. These are all different properties you can add to your shape. Things like pucker and bloat, for example. You may recognize some of these if you're an Illustrator user. These are basically like Illustrator effects you can add to the shape to modify the shape. If you decide you don't like one, you just click on the group, hit delete. Now in this case, the one I wanted to show is the one called Wiggle Paths. This is kind of a cool one because it automatically wiggles the shape and animates the shape. If I go into this Wiggle Paths group and crank up this size value, control the detail, corners are smooth, and there's a wiggle per second value that controls, how much it's wiggling. So you can see that in this case, all four sides of the rectangle are wiggling. Looks pretty cool, but I don't want the sides to be doing that. I want it to just look like a waveform. So if I go to my rectangle parameters and actually just zero out the height, so there is no height to the shape, that will actually fix that. And so now you can see just the top and bottom of that are wiggling. Looks pretty cool. And maybe I'll create another rectangle around that, maybe a rounded rectangle like this. Now you can see that when I do that, though, it's adding that to the top of the group, so it's also being affected by the wiggle paths. I don't want it to be affected by the wiggle paths. If I drag it below the wiggle paths, oops, have to carefully drag it down, there we go. Now you can see it's no longer being affected by the wiggle paths. Okay, so the order that you stack up shapes in within the contents of the layer does affect how they're composited, just like the stacking order of your layers affects the compositing. Now I'm going to take rectangle 2, I'm going to turn off the fill option, I'm going to turn on the stroke option, and adjust the stroke width. And then I'll go ahead and adjust the size parameters here and get it, kind of matched up where I want it. Take the arrow tool, I can move it and position it. I want it to kind of contain the other graphic there. There we go, something like that. That looks cool. All right, so hopefully this gives you some ideas for how to get started with shape layers in After Effects. There's a lot of really cool things you can do with shape layers. And as I'll show in a future recording, we can also convert shape layers into 3D shapes using the different render engines inside of After Effects as well. So this demonstration was really just showing how to get started using shapes, in 2 dimensions, but it is possible to create 3D objects out of them as well. So have fun exploring shapes. Like I said, use the add menu here and explore these different properties you can add to your shape groups to create interesting effects. And hope this helps you out. I'll see you in the next recording.